In this video, we'll review Chapter 38, Part 2, the Civil Rights Movement and the Increasing Conflict in Vietnam. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck at one of America's most persistent evils, which was racial discrimination. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government more muscle to enforce school desegregation orders and to prohibit racial discrimination in public accommodations and employment. The problem of voting remained. In Mississippi, still only 5% of eligible blacks were registered to vote, and this was similar throughout the South. The ballot-denying devices used were poll tax, literacy tests, and barefaced intimidation. Mississippi required that names of prospective black registrants be published for 2 weeks in local newspapers, which virtually guaranteed economic reprisals or worse. In 1964, voting became the chief goal of the black movement. The 24th Amendment, ratified in January 1964, abolished the poll tax in federal elections. And the Freedom Summer of 1964 began. This is when blacks joined with whites in massive voter registration drives in Mississippi. In June, 1 black and 2 white civil rights workers were murdered as a result, and Mississippi officials refused to prosecute those who were responsible. In August, the integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation was denied their seats at the Democratic Convention. And early in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. had resumed voter registration campaigns in Selma, Alabama, where 50% of the city's population was black, but only 1% were voters. A Unitarian minister was killed, and a few days later, a white Detroit woman was murdered by Klansmen. Johnson shepherded through Congress the landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was signed into law on August 6th. This outlawed literacy tests, sent federal voter registrars into several southern states. Over time, brought a dramatic change in southern politics and businesses. But soon, blacks began to migrate into the South for the first time since emancipation. This is the confrontation at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, 1965. The Voter Rights Act of 1965 was the last major legislative victory of the Southern-focused, integrationist, nonviolent civil rights movement. It increased focus on struggles in the urban North against discrimination and police brutality. 5 days after LBJ signed the Voting Rights Act, a bloody riot erupted in Watts, a black ghetto in Los Angeles. 31 blacks and 3 whites were killed, more than 1,000 people were injured, and hundreds of buildings were charred and gutted. This heralded the shift to militancy, radicalism, and separationism. The leadership of Malcolm X, who was born Malcolm Little, was inspired by militant black nationalists of the Nation of Islam. Like the nation's founder, Elijah Muhammad, born Elijah Poole, Malcolm changed his surname to advertise the lost African identity in white America. Malcolm X trumpeted black separatism. He later broke with Elijah Muhammad separatism and moved toward mainstream Islam. Early in 1965, he was killed by the Nation of Islam gunmen. This is a picture of Malcolm X, who was a hypnotizing speaker who could rivet and arouse crowds with his call for black separatism. The socialist Black Panther Party also used citizens' patrols to resist police brutality. In 1966, Stokely Carmichael, who was a SNCC leader, began to preach the doctrine of black power. Like Marcus Garvey of the 1920s, Carmichael breathed the separatist meaning into the concept of black power. It emphasized African American distinctiveness, promoted Afro hairstyles and dress, shed white names for new African identities, and demanded black studies programs in education. By 1967, there were more riots in black urban ghettos, like Newark, New Jersey, where 25 people were killed, and Detroit, Michigan, where 43 people were killed. As in Watts in 1965, rioters torched neighborhoods, and they attacked police officers and even firefighters. These riots angered many white Americans who threatened to retaliate. Riots baffled the Northerners, who considered racial problems a Southern question. The blacks moved north over the 1900s, and they faced residential discrimination, white out-migration to the suburbs, and deindustrialization. Black unemployment was double that of whites. The despair deepened when Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered on April 4, 1968, and this triggered more riots. The rioters made news, but thousands of other blacks quietly made history. The black voter registration in the South continued to shoot upward. By the late 1960s, several hundred blacks held elected offices in the Old South. Cleveland, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana elected black mayors. By 1972, nearly half of the Southern black children were in integrated schools. More schools were integrated in the South than in the North. About a third of blacks had risen into the middle class, so Martin Luther King left a shining legacy of racial progress, but he was cut down when the job was far from done. Vietnam continued during this time period as well, and the Viet Cong, who were guerrillas loyal to the North Vietnamese communists, attacked the U.S. air base at Pleiku, South Vietnam, in February 1965. Johnson ordered a retaliatory bombing raids against these military installations in the northern Vietnam area. For the first time, the United States ordered combat troops to South Vietnam. By mid-March, Operation Rolling Thunder was in full swing, and regular bombing against North Vietnam was taking place. Before 1965 ended, there were 184,000 American troops involved. Johnson had taken the slippery path toward escalation of the U.S. troops to drive the enemy to defeat. The guerrilla enemy matched every American increase. The South Vietnamese became spectators as the war became Americanized. The corrupt and collapsible governments in Saigon succeeded each other, yet the United States claimed to be defending a democratic ally. Hawks, people who were for the war, defended the war as a necessary evil to show U.S. commitment to fulfill numerous treaty pledges to resist communist encroachment. This is titled The Mechanized War, showing high technology and modern equipment such as the helicopter, which gave the Americans in Vietnam a huge military advantage but was insufficient to achieve final victory. Johnson steadily raised the military stakes in Vietnam. By 1968, 500,000 troops were there, and the annual bill for war exceeded $30 billion, and still there was no end in sight. The United States could not defeat the enemy in Vietnam, but it seemed to be bringing defeat upon itself. In terms of world reactions, several nations expelled Peace Corps volunteers in protest, and de Gaulle withdrew France from NATO in 1966 in protest and ordered all American troops out of France. The overcommitment tied America's hands elsewhere. In the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and gained territories in the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank of the Jordan River, including Jerusalem. This victory brought 1 million resentful Palestinian Arabs under direct Israeli control, and another 350,000 Palestinian refugees fled to neighboring Jordan. Israel later agreed to withdraw from Sinai after signing a peace treaty with Egypt, but they later refused to relinquish other areas without a treaty. They began moving Jewish settlers into a heavily Arab district of West Bank. The Six-Day War intensified the problems of a volatile Middle East. This became an intractable standoff between the Israelis and Palestinians, which continues today. Domestic discontent festered over Vietnam. There were campus teach-ins in 1965. Gradually, protest grew to tidal wave proportions. The draft claimed more and more U.S. men. Thousands of draft registrants fled to Canada. Others publicly burned their draft cards, and hundreds of thousands marched in protest. Many Americans felt the pangs of conscience at burning peasant huts and using destructive weapons. Congress's opposition to Vietnam was centered in the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, headed by Senator William Fulbright. He held a series of televised hearings in 1966 and 1967, and the public came to feel that they had been deceived about the causes and winnability of the war. The credibility gap opened between the government and the public. Within the administration itself, doubts deepened about the wisdom of the war in Vietnam. When Defense Secretary McNamara expressed misgivings about the war, he was eased out of office. By 1968, the brutal and futile struggle had become the longest and most unpopular foreign war to date for the United States. Casualties killed and wounded already exceeded 100,000. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than on all enemy territory in World War II, and the government had utterly failed to explain to the people what was supposed to be at stake in Vietnam. Johnson ordered the CIA, in a clear violation of its charter, to spy on domestic anti-war activists during this time period, and he encouraged the FBI to turn its counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, against the peace movement. COINTELPRO was falsely labeled, leading doves as communist sympathizers. These tactics made the FBI look like a totalitarian state's secret police rather than the guardian of American democracy. Evidence was mounted that the United States was trapped in a civil war which motivated the rebels versus the brutal government. Yet LBJ clung to the strategy of ratcheting up pressure bit by bit. He stubbornly assured Americans that he could see the light at the end of the tunnel, and to growing numbers of Americans it seemed that Johnson was bent on saving Vietnam by destroying it. This is a picture titled "The Vietnam Quagmire," showing one of the Marines for the United States carrying a rocket launcher across a stream near the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone, that separated North and South Vietnam. January 1968, the Communist offensive was launched on Tet, called the Tet Offensive, which was the Vietnamese New Year. The Viet Cong attacked 27 South Vietnamese cities, including the capital of Saigon. This showed Johnson's strategy of continual escalation was not working. The significance of the Tet Offensive was that it showed that this strategy was not working, and it ended in military defeat but political victory for the Viet Cong. The U.S. public opinion increasingly demanded that the war be ended. American military leaders responded to the Tet Offensive with a request for 200,000 more troops. This request staggered many policymakers. Johnson was challenged within his own party. Eugene McCarthy, receiving 41.4% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary on March 12, 1968. Johnson's star further fell 4 days later when Robert Kennedy entered the race for the nomination. Kennedy stirred a passionate response among workers, African Americans, Latinos, and young people. By March 31st, Johnson announced that he would freeze troop levels and scale back on the bombing, and he declared that he would not be a candidate in the 1968 election. Johnson's abdication had the effect of preserving the military status quo. He held the Hawks in check while offering himself as a sacrifice to the militant doves. The U.S. could maintain the maximum acceptable level of military activity in Vietnam while trying to negotiate a settlement. This is a political cartoon showing President Lyndon Johnson being haunted by the specters of Vietnam. In 1968, one of the hottest political seasons in U.S. history took place, with the Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's heir apparent, vying for the Democratic nomination. Meanwhile, McCarthy and Kennedy were dueling in primaries, and on June 5, 1968, Kennedy was killed by an Arab immigrant who was resentful of Robert Kennedy's pro-Israeli views. And anti-war groups converged on the Democratic Convention in Chicago in August of 1968 and were exasperated by some militant demonstrators. Police broke into a police riot on the guilty and the innocent alike. Humphreys gained the nomination on the first ballot because of the process of the privileged party officials over the primary results. This is a picture showing the siege of Chicago during the Democratic National Convention in August of 1968. At the Republican convention, which took place in Miami Beach, Richard Nixon became the candidate acceptable to the Goldwater conservatives as well as the party moderates. They tapped Maryland's Governor Spiro T. Agnew as the running mate to appeal to the white Southerners. Agnew was tough on dissidents and black militants. The platform called for victory in Vietnam and a strong anti-crime policy. There was a spoiler third-party ticket, also the American Independent Party, headed by George Wallace. He gained fame with his opposition to the civil rights movement. Between the positions of the Republicans and the Democrats on Vietnam, there was little choice. Both candidates were committed to continue the war until the enemy settled for an honorable peace, which would mean a U.S. win. Millions of doves had no place to roost, and many refused to vote at all. Humphreys, who was scorched by the LBJ brand, went down to defeat as the loyal prisoner of his chief's policies. Nixon won the election of 1968 with 301 electoral votes and 43% of the popular votes. However, Nixon faced Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress, carried not a single major city, received no clear mandate to do anything, and ended up being a minority president who owed his election to the divisions over war and protests against unfair draft, crime, and rioting. This is a map showing the presidential election of 1968 by electoral vote and popular vote for each candidate. Wallace won an impressive amount of popular votes, but only 46 electoral votes, all from the 5 states of the Deep South, 4 of which Goldwater had carried in 1964. Wallace amassed the third-party popular vote in U.S. history to that point, but this was the last third-party candidate to win any electoral votes. Ross Perot in 1992 enjoyed a greater popular vote margin, but won no states at all. Wallace demonstrated the continuing power of populist politics, which we're seeing in the current race today, appealing to voters' fears and resentments. Johnson returned to Texas in January 1969, only to die 4 years later. He had significant achievements in civil rights and helping the poor, but by 1966, LBJ had sunk into the Vietnam quicksand. The soaring war costs consumed tax dollars, and the war on poverty met resistance and would eventually go down in defeat. Johnson crucified himself on the cross of Vietnam. He chose to defend the U.S. stronghold and enlarge the conflict rather than withdraw. The decision not to escalate the fighting further in 1968 offended Hawks, and his refusal to back off altogether antagonized the Doves. There was much cultural upheaval during the 1960s as well, and the struggles of the 1960s against racism, poverty, and the war in Vietnam had momentous cultural consequences. There was a negative attitude towards all kinds of authority that took hold. Many young people lost traditional moral rudders, and the conventional wisdom and inherited ideas came under fire. The mainline Protestant denominations were weakened. Weekly church-going declined from 48% in the 1950s to 41% in the 1970s. Liberal Protestant churches suffered the most, with increasingly ceding religious authority to conservative evangelicals while surrendering the cultural authority to secular professionals and academic social scientists. As educated Americans became increasingly secular, less educated became more religious. Religious upheaval occurred in tradition-bound Roman Catholic churches after the Second Vatican Council, and skepticism about the authority had deep historical roots in American culture, including in the 1950s, with the Beat movement, which rejected a culture and politics of the 1950s decade, and movies like Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, showing young actor James Dean expressing restless frustrations of many young people. The disaffection of the young crescendoed in the 1960s as the baby boomers reached college age. One of the first protests against authority broke out at the University of California at Berkeley in 1964. This was the free speech movement, where students objected to the administrative ban on the use of campus space for political debate. Protests blossomed over Vietnam and soon saw the rise of the self-conscious counterculture, which was opposed to traditional ways. The social upheaval was far from an American-only phenomenon. Across the globe, youth-driven political and social conflict was roiled, and this was helped by the global reach of the youth pop culture, especially in terms of music. This is a picture showing the free speech movement in Berkeley, California. This is a student who has been schooled in passive resistance, being dragged by the police to a waiting bus. The 1960s witnessed also a sexual revolution, with the introduction of birth control in 1960 in the form of a pill which made pregnancies easier to avoid and sexual appetites easier to satisfy. The Mattachine Society, founded in Los Angeles in 1951, was a pioneering society advocating gay rights. The Stonewall Rebellion at New York City's Stonewall Inn in 1969 proved a turning point as victims of police brutality fought back. And in the 1980s, worries about sexually transmitted diseases like genital herpes and AIDS slowed but did not reverse the sexual revolution. This is a picture of the first gay pride parade in New York City in 1970, which is held on the anniversary of the Stonewall event, the Stonewall Riot, where 2 men and women basically were harassed by police and subject to police brutality. This launched a youthful idealism. Many of the decade's revolutions sputtered out in violence and cynicism. Students for a Democratic Society were formed, and once at the forefront of the anti-poverty and anti-war campaigns, they spawned an underground terrorist group called the Weathermen. Peaceful civil rights demonstrations gave way to urban riots. Experiments with marijuana and LSD spawned an underworld of drug lords and addicts, and critics denounced the self-indulgent romanticism of the flower children. Supporters hailed the greening of America, where materialism and imperialism was replaced by a new consciousness of human values. The upheavals of the 1960s can be attributed to 3 Ps: youthful population bulge, protests against racism and the Vietnam War, and prosperity that seemed like a permanent fixture of the post-war era. The counterculture, as it came to be called, may not have replaced older values, but it weakened their grip, and perhaps permanently. And we'll continue in our next video to discuss the feminist movement and its impact into the 1970s.